Thank you so much, Jess and Squinky, for joining me for this conversation where we get to talk about this new book that came out earlier this year, The Queer Games Avant-Garde, How LGBTQ Game Makers Are Reimagining the Medium of Video Games. I'm really thrilled to get to talk with you because Jess and Squinky are folks who I've worked with and known for a really long time. We together have worked on the Queerness in Games Conference, which is an annual event that brings together game designers and for game studies scholars. And it's, I don't know, I really love our event and this like generative space between design and academia, and it's like warm and fuzzy and beautiful. So I thought I would start out by inviting you to introduce yourselves, because then we get to hear about the latest thing that you're doing. Squinky, do you want to start us off?
Sure thing. Well, I am Squinky, which is short for Dietrich Squinkifer, and I am a trans autistic person trying to survive in a cyberpunk dystopia with varying degrees of success. And I make video games. Some of those video games I make with Jess and other people. We are actually in the process of starting a worker-owned co-op called Soft Chaos. And we have already been developing some stuff under that name, which I am excited to talk more about later. And I'm sure Jess will have a lot to say as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Squinky. Jess?
Well, thanks for the invite, Bo. I'm really happy to be here chatting with you folks too. So I'm Jess Marcotte. I'm an artist and designer focusing on a strange little kind of game called a hybrid game. And my research focuses on intersectional feminist and queer approaches to critical design. I'm hoping to finish a PhD this year.
That would be great. So I am Bo Ruberg. I use they, them pronouns. I think we all do use they, them pronouns. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Irvine, and a queer game studies scholar, but also I am just a huge fan of queer game design. And so this project that we're kind of using as a launching point today is a collection of profiles and interviews with queer and trans game designers who are making this really amazing array of work that is often scrappy and experimental and intimate and soft and strange. So there are about 25 folks interviewed in the book, including Jess and Squinky. And the idea behind the project was to kind of not take the traditional academic approach of just sitting and writing a book alone in a room, but instead to really talk to the folks who are on the ground making this really important work that is shifting what we think of as video games and also shifting the politics of video games. So it was really an honor to get to do these interviews. They happened a few years ago now. It's funny how this process works. It's been a few years. But really, really kind of opened my eyes to the richness of not just the design work that people are doing, but the really amazing thought processes that are going into that design work. So to start out, I was thinking we could talk about what kind of games you make. We were talking in 2017, actually, for this project, so it's been a few years, but I'd be really curious to hear, kind of what you've been working on since then. Jess, do you want to start us off this time?
Sure. So I've been making these hybrid games. So what a hybrid game is a game that combines really physical and embodied experiences, could have theater and physical components, along with digital parts and programs as well, kind of smushed together. Sort of, if you've heard of alternative controllers, it's sort of in line with that stuff, but a little bit different, just because the focus isn't necessarily just on the controls. And that's been a primary focus for my dissertation work. So I've been making games with puppets or games with like RFID sensors, or I have a little escape room in a suitcase project about feelings, always feelings. And I've also been making some work that I'm really proud of with Squinky and another one of our collaborators, Allison Cole, as part of Soft Chaos, especially in light of the shifts that like this year has required in terms of like physical access to each other.
Awesome. Thank you. I have so many questions about that, but I imagine, Squinky, that a lot of the stuff you've been doing maybe resonates with what Jess has been doing.
Oh yeah, definitely. I have also worked on some like alt control hybrid type projects as well. I've done some stuff involving like theater and like experimental like queer performance. I recently took some acting classes and enjoyed them a lot because acting is a lot like LARPing, but you do it in front of an audience. But being famous, like, I don't want to do that. Not anymore. That stuff is too exhausting. But yeah, so theater is something I'm into. But lately I have kind of gone back to working on a digital game project, so my like current solo work in progress is called Squinky and the Squinkets present Second Puberty, which is kind of like a reflection on hormonally transitioning and the associated feelings and recontextualization of my past, and like in that kind of light. And so I am expressing that through kind of like this album of 7 short games, 2 of which are finished, and I am currently working on the 3rd one. And yeah, also continuing to work on Soft Chaos with Jess and Allison.
Yeah, those sound awesome. All of the projects that you're both working on sound amazing. It's one of the things that I really love that comes up across the interviews in this book, and just generally the kind of world of people making queer games, is this combination of the physical, the like soft, the tangible, and then also the digital. And even like Squinky, even some of your work that hasn't been explicitly like theater or soft objects, like the Dominique Pamplemousse games, also have this really tangible quality, right? Because you've handmade so many elements of those games. So I'm curious, for you two, like, why is it that you bridge those things? Like, why bring together that really material quality with the digital?
Neko, do you want to go first?
Seriously.
First, Neko really wants attention because it's almost their lunchtime, but we can edit this out if it's too distracting. But then again, I've been told that people love seeing cats on Zoom calls, so you can leave it in if you want to, I guess. But yeah, anyway, so okay, now to actually answer the question. Yeah, I love working with like physical materials, and a big part of that is that it's kind of like a reminder that games are made by human beings. Because that process can be like abstracted out of a lot of like mainstream games. Like people don't really like talk as much about like the people making games as much as they do like other media. And there are also like a lot of like labor issues inherent in that. So there's like been a growing movement of like like labor rights and unions and worker co-ops in the game industry. And I feel like a big part of that is expressing that like games are made by people and they don't exist in this in this artificial like computer space. They are real. They're tangible things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it is really compelling to tie that to all of the labor stuff that's happening around games right now with Game Workers Unite. And I hadn't thought about that like bringing that into design is partially about like bringing the human into design. Mm-hmm. Does it feel similar for you, Jess?
Two things come to mind for me. The first being that like all games are like stored in some way in like a physical form, but that like these games kind of like make those things visible again and like sort of stop us from forgetting our bodies and forgetting like I don't know like that like we use these interfaces to play, and like I think there's a lot of opportunity there. The other thing is like it started off as like a really practical thing for me. When I first started to make games, I'm more comfortable with programming now, but I had like zero programming skills. Like I'd maybe like designed a website as a teen, like in the early 2000s or something. But I had like these ideas where like my reach definitely exceeded like my ability to make those things programmatically with the tools that I was using. So bringing in like these other elements, like these physical things that I was able to make, or like theater and like facilitation and acting and those types of things, I could add like layers of complexity to my work, even if I wasn't at a point where like I could do that like programmatically and get the result that I wanted. I think there's some like accessibility issues like that are inherent to these hybrid forms, but they also like, you know, there's a number of axes of accessibility, and like it was more accessible to me to be able to make these things at the time. So I think that's part of like where that interest comes. And I think the humanness of it and like the physical connection of it is also really important. So like one comment that like I will always remember about like one of the first games that I like showcased more widely was that it went to E3 and all of these like VR headsets. It was like 2014, 2015. There's all these VR headsets. Everyone's like, you know, like putting like these helmets on and like isolating themselves in VR. And like our game was about like consent and intimacy and touching. And Austin Walker said like, oh, like this game made me feel human again. And like, that's something that I'll always remember, I guess.
Yeah, that's really powerful because I've been on those same, you know, like show floors where everybody is in their own space and just to get people connecting again. Oh, shoot, there's something I was going to ask you about. And then it left my brain. Yeah, the accessibility thing is really interesting too. I think what you mean by the different kind of axes of access is like who can access game making, but then also there's a question of who can access the game, right? Like some of the work that you two have made together like is really centered around a specific object, like a physical object. So somebody might need to come to an event like QTCon, the Queerness and Games Conference, to play with you. But then also they don't need the same kind of like gamery skills to enter into the game. So I see what you mean. It's like access in some ways, but not access in other ways. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
This constraint of like who programs, who doesn't. I used to teach, you folks know this, but I used to teach at USC in the Interactive Media and Games division. And I taught this experimental game design class, which is my favorite class I've ever taught. The constraint I always found produced the most interesting stuff. So like I had one student make an entire game where it was just about lentils. Like they went to the store and bought like 7 different kinds of lentils and put them in tubs, and the entire game was about the experience of dipping your hand into tubs of lentils. And I love that project. I think there's a kind of misconception that people who don't have the coding skills that leads, like you can't produce work that's as strong in that way. But Squinky, you actually have a background, like you have much more of a kind of like traditional tech background.
I do. Yes, I did a computer science undergrad and everything, and like entered the game industry as a junior programmer. And like obviously, I branched out quite a bit since then. But like what I found, I guess, like maybe about like 10 years ago or so, when like the I guess like the queer games kind of movement was picking up steam, and and Twine was becoming a more popular platform, and there was this like big like kind of DIY aesthetic, like and a lot more tools available for people without programming experience. So like I saw that shift starting to happen, like while I was already working in games, and I actually like found it really exciting. I like thought that the games coming out of this whole movement were just like a lot more interesting and just had a lot more to say than what I had seen before that, I mean, like one project that really impressed me was the one Jess was just talking about, Intune, and it's like I met these game designers and was just like really really impressed with what they were doing, and now we are forming a worker co-op together, and we're really really good friends.
Yeah, I wonder, like, because the two of you have done so much collaboration, but also you're talking about working with other designers, and just the like spirit of a worker-owned co-op is really different than a lot of how the games industry functions. What is it for you about collaboration and like collective action that's important?
This is a very, very big question, I think. I have to think about that for a minute.
Well, I guess, and there are a few different ways to approach it, right? There's the organizing side. Obviously, a lot of work that we've all done is in creating collaborative community around queer games. There's the like more explicit labor side, and then there's also the artistic side, like in your own design practices. And maybe just to like, while you're thinking about it, something that's always on my mind, even though my practice isn't primarily an artistic practice, it's primarily a scholarly practice. A lot of the spaces we all inhabit can be really competitive. We've got narratives of like indie designers are supposed to be the like singular dude genius, or in academia, like you're supposed to be the one person who like publishes about this thing. And one of the things that queer games have always been really meaningful for me is to foster a sense of like, we work together, that like part of the ethos of doing this is that like we can produce much more interesting and meaningful things together, and that it's counter to the politics of that to try and like compete with one another. So it seems to me that maybe part of your practice kind of like takes up some of that spirit.
I think that like one of the most like compelling parts of any collaboration for me is sort of just like the ability to get outside of my own head by like seeing something through other people's perspectives. It really helps like identify like gaps. Like this is just like purely practical and very selfish. Like it's amazing to have like these really like interesting and smart people in a room with you, and they're like excited to do something with you, and you have this opportunity to like borrow that experience and like share all sorts of ideas that I don't think like would come out like out of any one person in the room. Like it's like just like stronger than the sum of its parts. I know that there's like some research about like how terrible and like mediocre group brainstorming can be. But I think like it is different when you have like full control over like the creative process together. So yeah, like I think it really makes me working with other people as a designer, also as like a community organizer, just like makes me a better designer and community organizer. Like it brings out things that I can't bring out like in isolation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Squinky, how is it for you?
Yeah. So like, actually the thing is like collaboration has been historically hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
And like a big part of that is I had to spend a lot of time just like trying to find my own voice as a game maker. And like the work I was doing in industry didn't really give me a lot of opportunity for that. It often felt like I was just like being plugged into an established project and like, okay, I'm doing my work. But meanwhile, I have this like need for like creative expression that that I could only do by myself for the longest time. So I approach game making from a pretty autobiographical, like in a pretty autobiographical way, and usually like I am trying to express things about myself. So where collaboration comes in is when it's being done right, it's not just about me anymore. It's about my relationship with the people I am working with, and and for it to feel good, it has to be based on a foundation of trust and respect and having fun together. And I'm just really happy to have found that in recent years, because like it was something I didn't have for the longest time.
Yeah.
I also wanted to draw it back to community organizing a bit as I think through this really rich question. I think the amazing thing about things like QGCon and the community organizing that we've done together is that, first of all, like of course, impossible to like run on your own. Like there's just too much to do and like too many things drawing your attention. But like when there comes to like a point of decision about like, say like taking a stance on something or like what we want like the future of our community to look like, being able to like have a gut check with other people and being able to like reflect together about what we want for that community is really, really powerful. Like it gives me the confidence to like say important and like potentially bold things because that's what's right for the community. And I think that's like a really powerful aspect of collaboration and also like community-minded work.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious how all of that background in community organizing and collaborative work, like how has that brought you towards Soft Chaos? I'm really curious to hear more about the work you're doing there. Even maybe just to start to tell us a little bit more about Soft Chaos.
So Soft Chaos is three people plus a guest artist like that, and the guest artist shifts around. So it's Squinky, myself, and Allison Cole, who is another amazing designer whose work has focused on a lot of different things, but including LARP and like these physically intimate experiences. And the basic idea is that like we want to work together, I think, in a way that like feels exciting and replenishing instead of draining. Like that's like I think like a really important aspect for me. That's kind of how I evaluate a lot of my commitments. Like, does this give me energy or does it take it away? Or does it take energy, but is it worth it? And so with Soft Chaos, we've designed like 2 projects so far and like a few other like brainstormy type things that I'm not too sure we know exactly where they're going to go yet. The first being we came together with guest artist Jenny Bacon to make a game for Golden Cobra, the Golden Cobra LARP competition, short form LARP. And that project is called This Is Fine, an apocalyptic networking game experience. It's terrible that I don't remember the last name of that. Apocalyptic networking event?
Yeah.
Yes, that's the one.
That's
Okay, so yes, I'll retake that. So it's called This Is Fine, an apocalyptic networking event. And in that game, we theorize somewhat prophetically about like the difficulty of having to like interview for a job while the world was like literally collapsing in an apocalypse around you. And our apocalypse was like flooding and fires and that sort of thing. But basically you're in that game, you're continually trying to, you know, seal the deal with like these like powerful white men who are like interviewing you at this conference and like pretending that you care about it because you need to survive under capitalism, while like things get increasingly worse around you in each act. And then we pivoted. So when all of this and these times started, we wanted to make something that we could play online that would still have like that sense of liveness and like that sense of like intimacy that like live action games can have, that like tabletop games can have. And we had played a few games together that took place entirely over Discord, like Banana Chan's The Circle. Banana Chan, and I'm not sure of
The Nexus.
The Nexus, yes, based on the TV show The Circle. And long-time listener, last-time caller. And these are games that take place entirely over Discord and like use all the features of Discord. And we decided that we were really, really both nostalgic for the 90s and felt like the fact that we were all online all the time and on Discord a lot felt a lot like our experiences with like old IRC chat rooms and like online communities in like the late 90s, early 2000s. So together we made a game called Strangers on the Net, which is about being a teen in 1999 who loves a particular ensemble cast fandom, whatever that fandom may be, and role-playing online in online chat rooms. And then partway through, there's a bit of a twist, but yeah. So that's the basic premise of that game. I don't know if you want to say more, Squinky.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been like, it's really like, I want to point out that it's like been really interesting to have been like designing and playing and co-facilitating Strangers on the Net while also like working on a game called Second Puberty. It's like all right, well, I guess like the theme here is adolescence.
Yeah, those projects all sound amazing. It sounds like it's been really productive. Like, you know, in these times, right, it's really, in some ways, hard to still be doing work, whether that's like academic work or creative work. But it sounds like something about this combination of the three of you plus an additional artist, or like being actually inspired by being online so much more, that's sparked a lot of really interesting stuff for you.
Mm-hmm.
I love this idea of being in 1999, I was 14 and I was very much on IRC all the damn time. So like, I love this idea of how do you kind of go back, pick that up again, like take that nostalgia and turn it into a kind of design principle is really cool.
So the game is about like confronting your past and like your problematic faves, maybe like beliefs that didn't age so well, that sort of thing. And yeah, like we wanted to make it something that was like both I think like nostalgic, but also critical, but also really intimate, and of course like super queer. Like most of the configurations of relationships in that game, unless we are explicitly asked not to, are very, very queer.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't imagine that like by the time that this airs, that like this will still be the case. But Bo, if ever you're interested, for QGCon Online on November 14th and 21st, we are running Chrono Trigger and Pokemon Strangers on the Net.
I will totally send you an email about that because that is super interesting. I've been like hiding in a little cave, I think, since March, as you also know in some ways. I tend to retreat into writing. That's my like happy place, but I should emerge from my cave and play things and see what's happening in the world again.
Well, we'd love to have you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm also super intrigued by This Is Fine. So I have like my own little rabbit hole current obsession is queer apocalypse in games, which like we've talked a little bit somewhat recently about how queer games more broadly, like what shifts we've seen and like talking about what's come into the QGCon arcade. And some of the points that you two made when we were talking over email that I think are really insightful is like there's some sort of movement happening, moving away from like abstraction and a kind of like just really trying to break down what we think of as a game and towards a kind of like coziness and community feel and like sometimes like femme aesthetics. But for me, I see that paired with like people thinking a lot about the end of the world. And this comes up in some of your work, right? Like Swinky in Queen's Class 7, like it's about, in a certain way, about the end of the world, the end of video games, but it's also super joyful and sparkly. So I'm just like, instantly I'm like, yes. This question of like, what is queerness at the end of the world? What is queerness after the end of the world? Transgalactic is like this too. There's tons of stuff that you folks have done.
Traces as well as like has like some big end of something vibes, I think.
I'll stop like ranting at you about it, but I'm curious like if this is something when you think about some of these things, what it is like, why are you drawn to thinking about that? Or like what potential, I guess I think a lot about both apocalypse as like it's like violence and frightening, but there's also some kind of queer potential in like ending the world as we know it, and thinking about other possible worlds.
That's definitely a big part for me is like the hope punkness of it, like the just the idea that like these things that we think are super entrenched or like these structures that seem totally immutable and unchangeable like can be changed or like that like I don't know, I guess I even like there's been like a lot of talk and a lot of articles in the past few months about like what preppers and like survivalists thought the end of the world was going to be and how it was going to allow them to like, embody this like rugged masculinity and like tough, like gun-toting, canned food eating, I don't know, like LARP of some kind, versus like what it's actually been like for communities and like how we've seen like mutual aid come into it and like how people care for each other when things become really difficult. And I think like that's something that I'm really interested in. And also just like this question of like what can we control and like what do we have power over as individuals and as like communities, like what do like we sort of get to decide how our communities and how our lives look like. And like there's just like a lot of potential there, I think, and it feels hopeful and like a really big opportunity for speculation about what comes next, like the end of something being the beginning of something else.
Yeah. To add to that, there is also like this element of like that seems like pretty common to a lot of queer experiences, but that I have felt very strongly is like coming into adulthood and discovering that like the kind of life you were expecting to have and the kind of life that like your like community and society were maybe expecting you to have like are not necessarily like what ends up happening. So like this like these like queer second puberties and adolescences that happen are just very like, it's like, all right, rediscovering like things and like, but also like this kind of like death of what you thought was going to happen. And we're also seeing that happening on a much wider scale. Like it can be like it can be argued in some ways that like this very like America-centered neoliberal capitalism is like kind of in the process of falling. And so now I guess we collectively are like trying to figure out like what's going to happen next. How can this be salvaged? Can this be salvaged? How do we rebuild it? Like whose voices have we marginalized and ignored and oppressed for so long? And like now it's like time to elevate those voices.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting to think about how the personal is like also paralleled in this larger situation. Like you're talking about like the decay of capitalism. We also like are facing major environmental collapse.
Mm-hmm. All related, of course.
What's that?
All related, of course.
Absolutely, yeah. And then also this personal queer experience. I know exactly what you mean of like in coming into a certain kind of queer self and queer life, it also means like letting go of things. There is a kind of like end of something and then like imagining what comes after. And I think I'm really drawn to the complexity of that. Like it's not just the simple narrative of like, now I'm myself and everything's great. Like there's also a kind of like mourning, but you're not exactly sad about it. It's a complicated feeling.
Oh, definitely. It's like, and even like, so I reread the book, The Queer Games Avant-Garde that we're talking about, like before this conversation, and like even like the amount of change I have gone through since 2017 has kind of been a lot. It's like. One example of that is like I talked a lot about asexuality, which was like my experience up until that point. But then like my sexual orientation changed on hormones, which led to like a whole recontextualization of my like experiences with sexuality and lack thereof, and the sudden presence of it in my 30s. So yeah, that was real interesting, and that's definitely like changing a lot of like the subject matter I'm exploring in my work as well.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's interesting about the academic publishing process, because by the time you do interviews and everything's out, it's a long time. And on the one hand, for me, that's a really valuable snapshot of a certain moment, both in terms of a wider network of people making queer games and in individual people's lives. But I think I worry a little bit about the way that like nails something down. It's like this one moment in Squinky's life, or this one moment in Jess's life, like then in being print doesn't allow for the kind of like queer like fluidity and shifts, and like our lives don't look the same one year to the next a lot of the time.
Yeah. And like similarly, like every game I make is a snapshot of who I was at the time as well. And like that is why I don't really like go back and change things after the fact, because like it's kind of like I'm not exactly that person anymore, and it would be like doing me a disservice to, like, say, for instance, go back and change things in Dominique Pamplemousse. And like, it's like, I wouldn't want to do that necessarily, because like who I was at the time was like a very specific person, and now I am someone else, and I am working on the next things.
Yeah, I think it's something when people, so one of the goals of this project and the book is to kind of like change certain narratives or intervene in certain narratives around queerness in games to like take us beyond I think like everyone in this Zoom room like is already thinking this way, obviously, but like beyond the kind of like neoliberal narrative about like put some, LGBT characters into AAA games, that like actually there's a lot of, there are politics, there are complexities of identity, there are things that are great, there are things that are really problematic in this kind of work of bringing queerness to games. So I think this is part of it too, right? That like, it's definitely not as simple as like make some queer games and then something is better. Yeah, does that speak to you too?
Yeah, absolutely. I spend a lot of time thinking about like what it means to design queerly, like beyond representation or beyond like being a queer person making games. And I guess like what I've sort of come to is that like this idea, Bo, that you've written about like desiring differently, and like this idea of like what are our desires, like not just like sexual or like not just about like gender, for our own bodies, for like the bodies around us, for like the systems around us, and like that there's like this whole idea of, I guess, like being a bit of a contrarian in some ways that like comes into it, and also like a bit around like just like what does it mean to desire differently, I guess, and like how does that come through in the work? And like I think a lot of the time for me it involves like just reframing best practices. Like this is general because it's so hard to be specific about it. But like, yeah, like this idea of like reframing practices, like rethinking like, things around like safety mechanics, or like what is represented, but also like what verbs are represented. Like, so one of the things that we sometimes talk about in game design is like verbs or actions that like the player can do as a mechanic. And yeah, so like this idea, like what verbs are we bringing into our games, and like what nouns even, sort of.
Yeah, Squinky, is that something you think about too, this idea of like designing queerly or bringing that kind of queer desire into games?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Like having worked in industry early in my career and like gone through formal education, I have constantly been like finding myself in as a game designer, looking back at these past assumptions that I have had to make about how to design games, and be like, well, why is it like that? Why can't I do something else? Why can't we do something else? And that's been great.
Yeah.
So yes, definitely.
It's interesting coming from the perspective of someone looking at the things that you folks design and other folks design, because I think to me that queer design question, like it comes out in the mechanics of games, the design elements of games. But one of the things that was great about doing the interviews for this project is that I also get to hear about the kind of queerness that came into the design process for a lot of folks. Laura McGee talks in the interview I did with her about like using like messiness and chance as a mode of queer design to kind of like take the order, take the control out of the process. Kara Stone talks about like trying to design a game that's played on her own body, which I love.
I've played that game.
Oh, good. Yeah. Kurt talks about like how hard it was to get people to play it, and like which I find fascinating, that like in bringing it into like traditional game spaces, people were kind of really freaked out, it sounds like, by that sheer amount of vulnerability and intimacy. And to me, that strikes me as its own kind of like queer design process of trying to get to a place where people will play with you in that way. So I know we're running up against time. The last thing I wanted to ask, I mean, I want to ask you a million things, but the last thing I was going to ask is about like advice for folks who are doing their own design and teaching. I think both of you have done some teaching, right? Because one of the hopes for this book is that people will pick it up who aren't just academics, or people who are, making their own games, like either students or people exploring their own design practice. And I wonder at this moment in your life, if there are certain things that you want other people to hear who might be like new coming into this kind of work.
This is another big and important question. For one, I think like the first thing that like a hard won lesson throughout like my design practice has been about burnout. And I think like it's really important to center like yourself and your needs. And part of that involves scope. Like just because you don't you have the time to make as many ideas as you want. So carve out like some space to consider what you're trying to accomplish, like with this one particular game, and like what you need to do that in a way that is very, very sensitive to like your own needs, I guess. So I guess like where that comes from is like having designed 3 alternative controller games in like around like in the end, I guess it was around like 7 to 8 months each. It was supposed to be 6 months, but like, yeah, this is a bit of a messy answer, but in a nutshell, like, don't burn out, take care of yourself. Like the work will be there, like when you're ready to do it. Try not to like make it your exclusive focus, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and goes back to some of the things around care that you were talking about before. Yeah, Squinky, do you have thoughts for folks?
Yeah, well, definitely, like your worth as a human being is more than your productivity. Something I am definitely feeling these days, but is like a message that I think like I definitely needed to hear when I was younger, and still benefit from reminders about. But yeah, there is there is definitely just like a lot of pressure to keep doing, and that like often, I guess, like when your like work and like your work and social and community needs like kind of are like as enmeshed as like some queer games communities have been, remembering that you are a human being first is like very important, but also like take joy in the work that you do, like have fun and play, yeah, there's and also other things like it's like you are the expert on yourself and your own experiences. Don't forget that. But also remember that you have elders, and that that other queer people have existed and come before you, some more recent, some less recent, and like you are not alone in your experiences. there have been people like you, and there will be people like you, and you can always like benefit from like the experiences of other people, even though you are the expert on the specifics of your own life. But you can still benefit from that of others. So yeah, a lot of these like kind of these kind of like dualistic, dichotomous, maybe contradictory kinds of thoughts, but like that's kind of what's interesting about giving advice, I guess. Like it can sometimes be contradictory, but that's like what makes it interesting and queer and messy.
And one thing that I want to add for folks just starting out, because like this has come up as I am doing some mentoring work, is like the mechanics that you choose don't have to look like other game mechanics. If you are making a game about like conquering space with guns or befriending aliens, take care about like what you were saying through your work, I guess. Like consider whether traditional game mechanics say the things that you would want your work to be saying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all amazing advice. It's amazing advice for game design, but also for life. Is really great. So thank you. Yeah, I'm fully on board. If there are also academics listening who are interested in queer game studies, like having fun and being strange and just like trying things out that make you feel feelings, like I am all that's in academia too. Like what are we doing if we're not doing that, you know? Awesome. Thank you both so much. Thank you for taking the time. It's lovely to talk to you and to hear about what you've been doing.
Well, thanks for having us. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks. And thanks for listening, whoever's out there.